Genesis chapter 41, verse 1. After 2 whole years, Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing by the Nile. And behold, there came up out of the Nile 7 cows, attractive and plump. And they fed in the reed grass. And behold, 7 other cows, ugly and thin, came up out of the Nile after them, and stood by the other cows on the bank of the Nile. And the ugly, thin cows ate up the 7 attractive, plump cows, and Pharaoh awoke. Have you ever had a dream like that? I've had some weird dreams, but nothing like this. Let's continue reading. Verse 4 now. Verse 5. And he fell asleep and dreamed a second time. And behold, 7 ears of grain, plump and good, were growing on one stalk. And behold, after them sprouted 7 ears, thin and blighted by the east wind. And the thin ears swallowed up the plump full ears. And Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it was a dream. So in the morning his spirit was troubled. He sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt. Dream interpretation was like the witchcraft of the day, all right? So he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all of his wise men. And Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was none who could interpret the dream of Pharaoh. I have a question for you this morning. It's not a question to answer out loud. Please keep the answer in your heart. Who is running this country? Who's running this country? If you were in Genesis 41, if you were living in ancient Egypt, the answer would be incredibly simple. Everybody would say, well, who's in charge? It's Pharaoh. Pharaoh's the one in charge. If you're a citizen in ancient Egypt, when we jump into Genesis 41, you would be supremely confident that Pharaoh is the man in charge running the entire nation. Everything was all under his control. He was the Pharaoh. Egypt was the most powerful country in the world at this time. The economy of Egypt stood firmly on the Nile River, which is very symbolic here because the Nile, oh, well, that's just a river. That's just a geographical location. No, that's talking about the economics. All the life, all the humans, all the people, all the animals, all the livestock got their food and water from the Nile. Huge economic resource. So Egypt stood firmly on the mighty Nile River, and all the people and cattle and animals would depend on the river for food and water. Very few countries in this ancient world were blessed to have such an economic resource as the Nile River. Egypt was the richest country in the world at this time. They had the first written first language, even predating cuneiform, which was the first complete system of writing. However, even before that, there's early forms of pictographs as Egyptian hieroglyphics. What does all that mean? Egypt was advanced technology. Egypt was not just the most powerful country economically and militarily. They had technology and contraptions nobody else had. The most powerful person that walked the earth, people would say, is the Pharaoh of Egypt. No doubt. Who runs the country? It was Pharaoh in their day. Egypt was the mightiest nation in all of the world. Who's running the most powerful country? Pharaoh. Everyone believed that Pharaoh was ruling everything. In fact, if Pharaoh said, you go to prison, you went to prison. If Pharaoh said, you come out of prison, you were out of prison. If Pharaoh said, I'm going to restore you to your job, butler, you're going to be restored to your job. What he said goes. There's no questioning Pharaoh. You see, Pharaoh is more than a king. He was treated and looked at and considered a god to them. I use God with the small g, but to them, it was not just that's our president, that's our mayor, that's our congressman. No. To an Egyptian, Pharaoh was God. He was the leader of the whole nation. He was worshipped as God. And yet you find him in a very unique situation here in Genesis 41. It's very few times where a person like Pharaoh can actually be troubled. Yet he has a dream, he wakes up, he doesn't know what it means, he goes to sleep. He has another dream, he wakes up, he doesn't know what it means, he's very troubled. He asks everybody in the world, everybody at his disposal, all the magicians, bring all your books, bring your witchcraft stuff, bring everything, tell me what this means. Use your mystical powers to interpret this. What does this mean? Nobody could. So verses 1 through 8 set the setting here. The most powerful man in the world is in a very unique situation. You see, while Joseph was still in prison, Pharaoh had two dreams that troubled him, and he could not find an interpreter. Let's look in verse 9 now. Then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, now this chief cupbearer, this butler we'll call him, was in prison with Joseph, and Joseph interpreted one of his dreams, and he got it right. Joseph said, remember me when you're out of here. He got out 3 days later. 2 years went by. He forgot him. Until now. Pharaoh has this dream. Now, let's pick it up again. Verse 9. The chief cupbearer, or butler, said to Pharaoh, I remember my offenses this day. He's saying, hey, Pharaoh, remember when I did you wrong and you threw me in prison? I remember that. When Pharaoh was angry with his servants and put me and the chief baker in the house of the captain of the guard, we dreamed on the same night, he and I, each having his own dream with his own interpretation. I'm not the only one that dreamed. My cellmate dreamed, he's saying. A young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. And when we told him, he interpreted our dreams to us, giving an interpretation to each man according to his dream, as he had interpreted us. And he interpreted us, so it came about. In other words, he was right. Myself and my cellmate had a dream. This guy interpreted it, and he got it right. And I was restored to my office, and the chief baker was hanged. Verse 14, then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph. Once again, you see, verse 14, and Pharaoh sent and called Joseph. Think of the power that's in his hand. He could do anything he wants. Oh, that person, okay, where is he in prison? Bring him here. I mean, anything is at his command. Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they quickly brought him out of the pit. And when he had shaved himself and changed his clothes, he got cleaned up before he could see the royalty, you know. He came in before Pharaoh, and Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have had a dream, and there's no one who can interpret it. So now Joseph comes from the prison, is standing before Pharaoh, got cleaned up, probably shaved, changed his clothes, got the ratty prison clothes off. Now he's standing before Pharaoh. Pharaoh says, I have had a dream, and there's no one who can interpret it. There's a term repeated in the next sentence I want you to see. Pharaoh is talking to Joseph, and he says this, I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. In other words, who does Pharaoh think is the answer to his dreams? Joseph. Hey, I've heard all about you. You can hear a dream. You can interpret it. Pharaoh's saying, I need you. Put yourself in Joseph's shoes for a minute. He came from the prison. Yes, he was in charge, but he's not used to being around what they would consider a god. Can you imagine what he was probably told before? All right, now, when you're before Pharaoh, you need to act like this, you need to act like that, bow many times, don't look him in the eye, whatever it was, right? Look how he responds back to Pharaoh. Verse 16. Joseph answered Pharaoh, it is not me. That would turn everybody's eyes right there. Hang on. You do not correct Pharaoh. Nobody in the country has the nerve to correct Pharaoh. So we can read over that. Oh, it's not me. Okay, he explained. No. He's already walking on thin right here. Thin ice. And then he said, it gets even worse. Joseph answered Pharaoh, it is not me. Heads are probably turning right now. Then he says, God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. Oh, you know what everyone is probably thinking? You're going to die. You don't understand. Joseph, Pharaoh is God. There's no talk of any other God around Pharaoh. What a statement that he makes to him there. Whoa. Yet he boldly proclaims God. Look at that. He says, "It is not me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer." Whoa. What is Pharaoh's response to this? Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Behold, in my dream, I was standing on the banks of the Nile." Okay, so we know this much about Pharaoh already. We know Pharaoh is at least wise enough to stop and hear what this is. He did not get quickly offended. He didn't say, "All right, you're out of here. It's not what I wanted to hear." He's not like the Pharaoh that Moses talks to in Exodus. This is a different Pharaoh. So he says, "Okay, let's give it a shot." He was troubled right here. He wanted an answer. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Behold, in my dream, I was standing on the banks of the Nile. 7 cows, plump and attractive, came up out of the Nile and fed in the reed grass. 7 other cows came up after them, poor, ugly, and thin. I've never seen them before like that. And the thin, ugly cows ate up the 7 plump cows. But when they had eaten them, no one could have known that they would have eaten them. They were still ugly and they were still thin. And then I woke up. And then I had another dream. I also saw in my dream 7 ears growing on one stalk, full of good. 7 ears withered thin and blighted by the east wind sprouted after them. And the thin ears swallowed up the 7 ears and told it to the magicians, but there was no one else who could explain it to me." Joseph said this to Pharaoh, "The dreams of the Pharaoh are one." Look at the boldness here. He says, "The dreams of the Pharaoh are one. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do." Stop and think about that. He's telling Pharaoh, "Pharaoh, you're not in control. God is. You may be sitting on a chair on an earthly throne, occupying the position of Pharaoh over the most powerful country in the world, but you're not in charge. God is." Unbelievable right here. Let's continue reading. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good ears are 7 years. The dreams are one. The 7 lean, ugly cows that came up after them are 7 years, and the 7 empty ears blighted by the east wind are all 7 years of famine. It is as I have told Pharaoh. God has shown to Pharaoh what he is about to do. Joseph says, "Hey, it's not me." Pharaoh was like, "It's you, it's you, it's you." No, it's not me, it's God. Tell me your dream. He told the dream. Well, God is telling you, he interprets dream, then he says, that's what God says. All on purpose. All on purpose. Verse 29, let's finish this out here. "There will come 7 years of great plenty throughout the land of Egypt. But after all of them will arise 7 years of famine. All of the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt, and the famine will consume the land, and the plenty will be unknown in the land by reason of the famine, for that will follow. For it will be severe." In other words, you're going to have 7 years of a great harvest. You're going to have the economy is going to be booming. The housing market's going to be booming. The stock market's going to go way up. The grain is going to be plenteous. People are going to be handing out $100 bills to homeless people. That's what he's saying. The 7 years as the economy was booming. After that 7 years, it's going to be 7 years of famine, like you've never seen before. And everything's going to be eaten up, and it's going to get desperate. Verse 32. The doubling of Pharaoh's dream means, look at Joseph's emphasis here. The doubling of the dreams means that the thing is fixed by who? God. And God will shortly bring it about. Whoa. What a scene where this prisoner stands before the most powerful person in the world, Pharaoh, and testifies that, "Pharaoh, you're not in control. God is. This is what's going to happen." So in the third scene here, second scene, we see that the butler remembered Joseph. Pharaoh called Joseph out of prison, and Joseph interpreted his dreams. There's one more scene in this, verses 37 through the rest of the chapter. It's simply, I'll just summarize it for time's sake. Joseph proposes a plan which Pharaoh accepts. Let's look at that. Verse 33, now therefore let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh proceed to appoint overseers in the land and take 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt during the 7 plentiful years. Let them gather all the food and for all these years that are coming up and store. And let's store up the grain under the authority of Pharaoh for food for the cities. In other words, we got to do something. You have to be wise stewards during this time of this plenteous, with all this grain coming. You need to select somebody to be in charge, Pharaoh, and you should probably give your authority to somebody who can manage the operation. Otherwise, all of mankind's probably going to die. Because every country in the world, during that famine, guess where they're going to go for help? Egypt. Richest country. They have the Nile. Those resources there. Joseph proposes a plan which Pharaoh accepts. Joseph is promoted to second in command of Egypt, and he is the one to steward all the resources and to preserve life. Joseph gets married in this chapter. He has 2 kids. The 7 years of plenty come, and Joseph was in charge, second in command to Pharaoh over all of Egypt, was in charge. He stored food and the grain, and then the 7 years of famine came after that. People started coming to Egypt. Pharaoh, what do we do? Pharaoh says, go to Joseph. He's got the plan. Go to Joseph, and Joseph was in charge. So that leads back to the beginning question. Who's running this country? Is Pharaoh running the country of Egypt? No. Now, this is where most people miss it. Is Joseph running the country? No, he's not. See, when you read this so many times, it's easy to be distracted by the people and look at the people as the heroes. Joseph is not the one running this country. God is. God gave Pharaoh those dreams. Pharaoh was used to being in charge of everything. All messages came from him. In this story, Pharaoh is not the subject, he's the object. And what that means is Pharaoh is not giving the message. He's not the one in charge. He's receiving the message from God. God is in charge. He's not generating the message. He's being told the message. The message is from God. So the initiative was taken from him. Pharaoh didn't have a plan. He didn't know what to do. The most powerful person in the world is powerless before God. This is similar to the Pharaoh in Exodus. In the next book of the Bible, Genesis, the second book of the Bible, as we typically see it laid out, is the book of Exodus. In the first few chapters there, you hit around chapter 7, chapter 8, you'll meet a person named Moses by that time, and he's also in Egypt, and he also has an opportunity to stand before the Pharaoh of his day, same country, same position. And every time Moses stands before Pharaoh, he's told to by God, and do you know what God tells him? You can look it up later. Exodus starting chapter 8 through all of the plagues. God tells Moses to say to the Pharaoh, "Thus saith the Lord God." Whoa. He said, tell Pharaoh he's not pulling the strings. Tell Pharaoh he's not God. I am. Same thing happening here. Moses was saying, you're not, Pharaoh, you are not God, and you're not in control in Exodus. Same thing Joseph is saying in Genesis. Difference is the reactions. The reaction in Exodus, you can read it, it's a total different reaction. Ooh, he did not like that. That was not a good Pharaoh. This Pharaoh realizes he's not in charge, so he submits to God's plan. Pharaoh actually thought it was about Joseph. You, remember? Joseph says, it's not me, it's God. God has revealed to you. God has shown to you. The thing is fixed by God. He's saying, don't you think it's about me? It's not about me, it's about God. Even later in Genesis 45, remember when his brothers come to Egypt? We'll get to it in the coming weeks. Joseph actually tells his brothers, this whole story is not really about me. He says, God has sent me before you to preserve life. And that's Genesis 45:7. So the sovereign ruler in this passage over all of the world is not Pharaoh. The sovereign ruler over all of the world is not Joseph. The sovereign ruler is God. God is using Joseph to show everyone that God alone is the sovereign ruler of all nations. And Joseph teaches Pharaoh that very important lesson. You're not God. You're not in charge. Once again, these are questions in your heart. Please don't answer these out loud. So what does this mean to us? Well, in your heart, who's running this country? Some believe the current president is running the country. Some believe the current president is not running the country. Some believe the president 4 years ago ran the country. Can I tell you? God alone sovereignly controls the destinies of all countries. All countries. Does not matter who sits in the Oval Office. God controls the destinies of all nations. You see, since God sovereignly controls the destinies of all nations, you can maintain confidence in God no matter what happens to your nation. No matter what happens to your nation. Don't find security in a government. Find your security and identity in Jesus Christ. Genesis 41 is a very important lesson because it reminds us that God has a purpose for the events and everything that takes place in every nation. It does not matter what will happen to this nation, to your nation. Maybe you're visiting, maybe you're going to move to Guatemala, Spain. It doesn't matter. This is not about the United States of America. It is about every nation God controls the destiny of. Doesn't matter if you move to Mexico next week. Same sermon could be preached. God used Egypt to provide for the Hebrews during the time of famine. So it does not matter what happens to this nation, no matter what happens, no matter what law you see passed, no matter what you see retweeted or shared on Facebook, it does not matter. Your confidence should be in God. And if God is not enough, you don't know him very well. So what? So, okay, we get it. God's in control. So what? So find your assurance in God. Find your assurance in God. Your morale should not fluctuate with whoever is sitting in the Oval Office. Your morale should always remain high because God is still on his throne controlling the destinies of nations. So who do you trust? Who do you get your assurance from? What does it take to shake your faith? If your assurance comes from a place about 350 miles away, that's called Washington, your faith will be thrown all over just like the stock market. The origin of your faith should span more than 350 miles. The origin of your faith should span all the way to the throne of heaven. This passage is not about Joseph. It's about God. God controlled the dream. God controlled the interpretation of the dream. God controlled the response to the dream. All the magicians and all the wise men of Egypt could not interpret the dream. And all the politicians all over the world are just like Pharaoh and his magicians of Egypt because they think they're in control when in reality they are helpless to the Almighty God sitting on the throne of heaven. But you know what? Sometimes we can be convinced they're in control when we don't have that view of God on his throne, controlling the destinies of nations. The fact that God used an Israelite slave, look at that picture of Pharaoh in his throne room probably. When Joseph came before Pharaoh, God used an Israelite slave to confound all of the wisdom of Egypt. And it shows that how every nation on earth, no matter how powerful, is subject to God's sovereign control. God was sitting on his throne ruling before 1776. God will rule after the 2024 election. God will rule after the 2028 election. God will rule after the 2032 election. God will rule after the 2036 election. God will rule after the 2040 election. God will rule after the 2044 election. And if there's ever a day in this country when the elections no longer take place, you can still have confidence because God is still on the throne. No matter what law is made, no matter what legislation is passed, no matter how the votes tally up, God cannot be voted off his throne. He can't be. No vote can take God off his throne. He's not God by popular vote. So find your assurance in God and God alone. None of them. Nobody can vote God off his throne. God will still rule. After everything else in this world, after every nation in the world comes crumbling down in the fulfillment of the book of Revelation in the end times, God will still be there. He'll still be on his throne. Pharaoh gave Joseph a new name after he promoted him. It's in verse 45. Let's look at it. Verse 45. And Pharaoh called Joseph's name. Now, I got to be honest. There are some names that I need to practice pronunciating. I didn't practice this one, so you can just see the name there because it's about 12 letters, and I'm not very good at that one, all right? But the point is, I know what the name means. So I can't say the name, but I know what it means. Pharaoh gave Joseph a new name. It says, and Pharaoh called Joseph's name, here's the meaning of it, God speaks, God lives. That's what the name means. You see, Pharaoh was admitting he's not the one in charge. And Pharaoh learned that lesson from Joseph. When Pharaoh was like, it's you. Joseph, you're my hope. He says, no, God is. And Pharaoh renamed Joseph, saying, Joseph, you're right, it's not about you. In fact, I'm not even going to call you Joseph. Joseph, I'm going to call you God speaks, God lives. Pharaoh realized God was in charge. He was willing to admit that he was not in control. God is. So find your confidence in God alone. But also, there's something else we can do. We can also thank God for his provision. We can thank God for his provision. God knew this horrible famine was going to come. And you see, that's terrible that the famine's coming. Imagine if God did not have the grace, did not express the grace to warn them. This vision that troubled Pharaoh was a blessing from God. It was his grace because it was a warning telling him, hey, you need to do something because I want to preserve life. What does that mean? It means that God knew there was a horrible famine coming. So he sent Joseph to Egypt to provide for his people. God will provide for his own. And if you've accepted Christ, no matter what happens, no matter what country you live in, no matter what time, God is outside of time. You can not only have confidence in God, no matter what, but you can thank him for providing for you, no matter what's coming down your road next year. Next 3 years. Maybe there may be an event in your life, or you may have a famine in your life, as you would call it, a trial coming later today or tomorrow. We don't know. You don't know. We're not guaranteed tomorrow. But if you are a child of God, you can thank God for his provision. God provides for his own, and he has provided for you. It doesn't matter if the stock market crashes. It doesn't matter if the housing market crashes. God will provide for his own. And if you don't know Christ as your Savior, if you don't have a personal relationship with God, if you cannot stand up and say something similar than what was said by Ryan and Kaylin this morning, I would love to open the Bible and tell you how you can know God. And God will provide for you. When you know God, you can thank him for his provision. God was in control of all the nations in the book of Genesis. God was in control of all the nations in the book of Exodus, no matter how the ruler reacted. God is in control of all of the nations in the New Testament as well. I don't know when there will be a famine. I have no clue. I'm not predicting anything. I'm just a normal guy. But the lesson here is that God is in charge, not earthly rulers. And it's not only in Genesis, it's not only in Exodus, it's also in the Gospel of John. And I'll just read a couple verses from John chapter 19. It was not Egypt that was the mightiest nation in the world in the Gospel of John in New Testament times. It was the city of Rome. It was the Roman Empire. They beat the Greek Empire. They conquered the Greek Empire. And during all of the New Testament, from in your Bibles, when you see the Gospel of Matthew, that short section at the end, all of that took place under the Roman Empire. They had their own rulers in that day. And one day in John chapter 19, it's recorded that Jesus Christ stood before a ruler for a trial. It's not that different than Joseph standing before Pharaoh. In John chapter 19, Jesus stood before Pilate in his trial. And John 19, verse 10 and 11, listen to this. So Pilate said to them, Pilate was telling him, well, you have all these accusations, and Jesus didn't say a word to him. This is what Pilate said. Will you not speak to me? Do you, Jesus, do you not know that I have the authority to release you and the authority to crucify you? Listen to Jesus' response. You would have no authority over me at all unless it was given to you from above. Whew. Jesus is saying, Pilate, you think you're in charge. You're not in charge. Everything's given to you from above, from God. Jesus Christ willingly submitted himself to a crooked government because he knew that God was in control, providing salvation for you. And there's one provision that you can thank God for today. It's that Jesus Christ submitted himself to Pilate and willingly took on the cross and was nailed to the cross and died and was buried in the grave and rose again 3 days later. Why? Because he knew the government was not really in charge. Pilate, it's not you. You don't understand, Pilate. God is doing something far greater than you. You think you're in charge, Pilate? You're not. God is. And Jesus Christ willingly submitted himself when he knew Pilate wasn't in charge, to provide forgiveness for your sin so you can have a relationship with God. So there's one provision that everybody here can thank God for. It's for the forgiveness of sins and having the relationship with God. And that's the only way that you can live with him in all of eternity in heaven. I don't know if there's a famine coming, but I do know there's a fire coming for anyone who rejects Christ. And Jesus Christ paid the price for you. Do you know him as your Savior? If you died today, do you know that heaven would be your home? Can you thank God for that provision today? God was sitting on his throne, ruling the nations to provide salvation for you. So, still didn't answer. Who's running this country? Since God sovereignly controls the destinies of nations, you can maintain confidence in God no matter what happens to this nation or your nation, wherever you live. God is running all countries.